Begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Today we have Becca Tiernan here to talk about her fellowship experience in South Africa with Pippin Anderson, one of our NATURA network partners and coordinating committee member. After Becca presents, we're going to have a bit of time at the end to just kind of talk about any of the exciting opportunities or events that, if you guys would like to advertise them, that are going on in our very large network of networks. So if you're ready, Becca, you can take it away.
Okay. 1 second. Can everybody see my screen okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk about my experience. I was, as Tessa mentioned, a NATURA fellow this past fall in Cape Town, South Africa. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about my time there. So I'll briefly talk a little bit about myself, just to give an introduction, since I think many of you I haven't met before. I'll talk about Cape Town a bit and what I was able to experience and learn there in such an amazing place to stay for a few months. And then I'll talk a little bit about my fellowship work, what I did for NATURA, mostly on the global roadmap, and then some of my professional and personal development that I did for my research. And I'll just summarize with some highlights and reflections at the end. So about me, I'm a second-year PhD student, and I'm co-advised at Arizona State University by Nancy Grimm, who of course is here, and co-founder of NATURA, and also Jim Collins. I have a bachelor's of science from UMass Amherst in natural resources conservation, where I focused on wildlife ecology and conservation. And more recently, I moved into science policy, so I have a master's in science policy from ASU and some experience in the working world doing stuff on citizen science and other science policy endeavors. But last year for my fellowship, I went to Cape Town with Dr. Pippin Anderson, and I spent 15 weeks starting about September, end of August through mid-September. And my time there was really interesting. I got to do a couple of different field trips throughout the time with Pippin and various other academics from UCT and from around the world. We had people coming in who were visiting Pippin from Stockholm who would come, and we could do field trips with them. But I also did some presentations and meetings at Stellenbosch, the University of Stellenbosch, and at ICLEI Africa, one of NATURA's partner groups, where I also got to work with them a bit on developing some other paper ideas that they were working on. And also more broadly, the time was spotted with lots of networking opportunities and discussions with other faculty, graduate students, and other researchers and academics in the area who I was able to be connected to, often through Pippin herself. But a lot of the time too was self-driven exploration. So traveling around, getting to know the city and experiencing nature firsthand, and also looking for nature-based solutions, of course, in the city. So I'll just highlight that Cape Town and all of South Africa, really the coast in particular, is a part of the biodiversity hotspots that have been identified. And so this Cape Floristic region is where I spent the majority of my time. So, and looking at South Africa again, that's really in this small portion here around Cape Town. And just on this peninsula alone, most of the city center is here, but this whole peninsula area sort of constitutes the Cape Town city portion of the Cape Floristic region. And that space is just an incredible biodiversity hotspot. So when they're saying hotspot, they completely mean it. And so there are about 9,000 plus plant species within the Cape Floristic region alone, and 3,000 or more than 3,000 in that city limit on the peninsula. And that, to put that in reference, there's about 20,000 species of plants in South Africa, and then 45,000 on the continent. So a huge proportion of these are concentrated on the peninsula, and they're also very high endemicity. So it's an even more sort of, it's a very unique place to be able to go and spend time, especially with an urban ecologist and an urban plant ecologist like Pippin, and get to learn about some of these really fascinating species that you can't find anywhere else in the world. But the system's extremely threatened by lots of different forces, external forces. So urbanization, urban expansion, exploitation of the plants, use of plants, and then pollution, climate change, invasive species, and fires. And I'll talk about these a little bit more further, but I just wanted to include sort of some of these pictures of ones that I just found particularly striking, because these, yeah, I've never seen plants like this in my life. So these were quite cool, but unfortunately, I don't think I could ID them all. So Pippin tried her best. But I also wanted to call attention to, not only are there an immense diversity of plants, but the wildlife there is also immensely diverse. Not all of these pictures I took in the Cape Floristic region. Of course, the elephants and the wild dogs, for example, those are some megafauna that are found in the national parks that I in particular saw in a different part of the country. But I did want to highlight that there are so many other species that are located in this country and also in the Cape Peninsula that are also threatened by these similar forces as the plant species that I was highlighting. And I'll just draw attention here to the penguin colonies. So the African penguins, they're only found in South Africa and I believe in Namibia now. But they're an extremely endangered species due to climate risks, but also lots of human activities. So offshore fishing and use of their guano for different fertilizers has really threatened that species. And so they're implementing some really strict environmental policies now to try and mitigate that risk of the species going extinct, but it's still something that is a likely occurrence in the next 10 years if there aren't major changes. So I just wanted to highlight this other range of diverse fauna and flora that are there as well in this area. And so a lot of my time that I was doing in my self-exploration was trying to explore the urban nature in Cape Town. And so I was going around to public parks, the botanical gardens or other public garden spaces, and the public beaches and beach fronts. And so all of these were either low fee entrance or free to enter for me to be able to go and utilize this nature. And so I think that was a really striking thing to have so much access to nature in the city limits. But notably, that access is not universal. So for one thing too, a lot of the areas are not necessarily very safe. So you can take general precautions to be fine. And so I was perfectly fine in these areas, but there is an increase in crime. So nature has some threats to be going into it. And so that's something to keep in mind. But then there's also lots of different values around the use of the nature that's in the Cape Town area. So there's different ideas of what is valuable. Should this be a reserved space that shouldn't be utilized? Or we have lots of people who want to use a lot of the nature that's there for indigenous medicine or traditional practice. And these are conflicting values that are causing tensions in this urban nature space. And also a lot of the nature isn't accessible, or the green space is not equitably distributed throughout the city. So this is just a figure from a paper that came out a couple of years ago that was showing where the legacy of apartheid in the city, which really is not that old. It's only about 30 years now that apartheid has ended in the city or in the country. But the legacies of it ecologically and in the green space access, they remain. So in some of the lowest income areas that are here in the Cape Flats, there's the least amount of accessible green space, whereas in the wealthiest areas of Cape Town, where I took all of those pictures and where those urban nature parks are, you'd have to be able to access this with a vehicle or be able to get taxis in and have the time and the availability to do that. And so the accessibility of these areas of nature that are in the city are not accessible to all. And that accessibility is further threatened and amplified, or these issues are further threatened and amplified by the broad series of environmental, sociopolitical, and climate challenges that the country also faces. So Cape Town and South Africa more broadly have been embroiled in a water scarcity issue for many years now. The day zero was essentially planning for when there may be no water at all in Cape Town, and they were able to avoid this through pretty miraculous attempts, but it's still water scarcity and the drought continues, and it's a huge threat to livelihoods in South Africa. And load shedding is the countercut that the energy companies in South Africa have to maintain because there isn't sufficient energy to meet the demands. And so while this is much more of a political issue, it has a lot of different environmental and social outcomes or knock-on effects that occur. But so all of these inequities in nature and these inequities just in the country in general are further amplified by these interlocking environmental and political issues that are occurring in the country, with extreme weather events increasingly frequently occurring, so flooding, fires, increasing heat events and longer durations of heat events. And this is further exacerbated too by these other forces of urbanization, urban expansion, habitat loss, conversion to farmland, and further and other agricultural activities. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of the events that occurred while I was there that were pretty striking to me. One being a massive flood event and multi-day storm that had incredible amounts of flooding that has remained or left roads that are still damaged to this day. There's certain roads that you can't take along, especially the southern coast of South Africa, known as the Garden Route, but the flooding had significant damage in the city, but especially in some of the informal settlements that were in the nearby places. And then the fire that happened right before I left, there was a big fire on Table Mountain, close to Simonstown, which is the town famous for the penguin colony, the penguin breeding colony near Cape Town. And this fire burned for several days and caused some damage to property, but also was just a pretty striking event of increasingly frequent fires happening in a place where it's harder to manage these fires because of the changing of the ecology due to the invasive plants that have come and the changing to the land done through urban expansion and things like that. But I did also want to highlight this group that Pippin had introduced to me called Melted Sea. It's a woman who runs workshops on coastal foraging, and they manage their land with indigenous practice. And so this is her land that was left completely almost untouched and unburned by the fires. And she credited a lot of this to how they manage their land and maintain the original flora and fauna there on their property, and removing invasives and things like that, and trying to restore the land as close as possible to the fire driven system that it is naturally. And already just within a couple of days of the fire, there were all kinds of new life coming, lots of seeds that had been waiting for probably a long time to hit the right intensity and of heat and fire to be able to germinate again. And so there's going to be lots of new life on the mountain, but it's another striking example of how climate change is creating these new opportunities for needing to manage, and how traditional practice and nature-based solutions can actually help to manage those issues as they occur. So I'll just switch gears now and talk about what I actually did during my fellowship. I think I wanted to present some of the context of the country and what I was able to learn there, and the context in which I was learning some of these different pieces about nature-based solutions. So just for the next couple of slides, I'll talk more broadly about what I was doing for the global roadmap and how I was trying to work on my own research. But having this new context to me that I hadn't been in before was really eye-opening, I think, and helped provide more of a holistic perspective and helped to ground truth some of the findings that I was having during my work on the NATURA piece of the global roadmap. And so I think many people are probably familiar with the global roadmap, but I just wanted to put this work plan up again to show the 3 different streams of the roadmap and the goal of the roadmap as well. and where the first piece is the literature review and synthesizing the regional research for the different regions. I spent the majority of my time in South Africa working on the Africa team, or on the Africa nodes themes. And so I'll just put I have a couple slides here that I pulled from a previous presentation that I gave. So they're a little bit dense on words, so I won't go super in depth on them, but I did want to share some of those preliminary findings that we've been pulling and talk about how they were received when I would share them with others. So just a quick brief overview of the methods that we've been using for the literature review. This is again from the academic literature. And so we've done some work in screening and tagging, and I wanted to highlight my team members as well. And of course, it's here, and Natalie and Vanya, who have been working with me on this project as well, and Loan and Natalie really leading this work. And then in this final step that I'll share some of the findings from is in diving into the themes of each of these for each of the regions that we're talking about. And so I'll just share some preliminary results from the Africa node now, where we dove into themes on water management, quality, agriculture, and urban farming, and on green space and green infrastructure. And so I won't dive into all of this because I know this is quite dense, but I wanted to just say a couple of things about each of these themes that I think have also been showing to be true in my experience in the region, both in South Africa and some of the other travel I did around the Southern African area. But some of the main things that are coming out of these themes on water management and quality is that flooding is an increasingly huge risk, and that was clear. I had a lot of coastal flooding, but there were also a lot of events that happened while I was in that area that were due to riverine flooding, which is one of the primary risks in a lot of these areas. And what is constantly talked about is the lack of wastewater infrastructure. So the floods can cause a lot of damage to infrastructure in general, but without having wastewater infrastructure, there is more threat of health issues as well and threats to the ecosystem. So a big focus on needing to have interventions that can manage for wastewater infrastructure was a really big focus. And particularly in informal settlements where this infrastructure is extremely lacking, but that there is, and that nature-based solutions can be a low-cost way to do this, but that there needs to be the will to manage them over time and monitor them over time, but that there's also a preference against having nature-based solutions for these kinds of problems. For urban agriculture and urban farming, this is a huge priority for the African region coming out of this literature, because food security is such a huge concern, especially declining nutritional value of the food as well. So there's like two main problems with this, is that there's not enough food and the food isn't nutritious enough, and there isn't really a set strategy yet for that. And so urban agriculture can be a way to fill some of those gaps, but that it can't necessarily solve the problem. So it can reduce some of the strain, but it can't necessarily solve all of the problems there. So there needs to be more of a broader plan and strategy for this. And then on green space and infrastructure, there's important ecosystem services that can come, but there's often a lack of consideration of place, competing land use priorities, and then that the green spaces can amplify those inequities. So this is really what I was talking about a lot at the beginning when I was saying how all of these parks I could go to or access, they're not necessarily accessible for everybody. So, and the way that people might want to use those spaces have different values attached. So there's a lot of conflicting areas of that. And some overarching takeaways just from the whole literature review so far. And again, these are preliminary results that are still ongoing in the analysis, but that there's this underrepresentation of the African context in the literature, and that a lot of the contexts that are studied are predominantly in the global north. And so they don't reflect the reality on the ground in a lot of the places in Africa and in the global south more broadly. And that the focus for nature-based solutions here really needs to be on capacity building and stakeholder engagement, community building, and that there needs to be a big focus on equity and justice, and looking at the context here of informal settlements, urban expansion, new and recent land use and land cover changes, and also looking here at the direct provisioning services and how those are often a bit more immediately talked about in this context, in the development context. So those are just some of the takeaways I have so far from this work on the part one. And when I presented this to external parties, I think a lot of people felt that this reflected the scenario or the situations that they were experiencing, especially people who were practitioners in nature-based solution work, but that there is a lot more of that community piece that's not necessarily captured, and that, again, there is sort of this underrepresentation in the academic literature, but there's so much happening in practice. And I think this is complemented. I won't talk about part two of this roadmap, but this is a part that focuses on building case studies to complement the part one, which looks at the literature or what's coming out of the literature, whereas this part two is building on case studies that are happening in the happening in the region and looking at how they're successful or where they've had challenges. And so Inka Horn, she's the fellow lead for the Africa team, and she's been really leading this work for the Africa node. And so talking with her about her experience working with these different actual practical on the ground experiences, and then talking with other people who have been involved in these projects, reading about them, you can see that there's so much activity happening. And so when the literature says that there's an underrepresentation of the African context, it's kind of a question of why is that happening? And so that was a big conversation that I had with people, especially at IGLI Africa, where there's so much activity on nature-based solutions, and why is there this gap here? And so I just wanted to also add a little bit about some of the personal growth and development work that I had while I was there, in addition to the fellowship work on the NATURA pieces. And so I mentioned a couple of times that I did some presentations. So the presentations that I gave were both on the NATURA work, but also on my own research ideas as a way to try and workshop them a little bit, but also to build some connections and hopefully have some collaborators on things that I'm interested in, as well as trying to build out the NATURA network and the support for the global roadmap. But I have some opportunities for further collaboration with ICLEI, including on potential paper ideas, in particular focusing sort of on that practice to policy and practice to literature gap there. And I think that the time there really deepened my understanding of urban nature-based solutions and allowed for a lot of opportunities to workshop these research ideas. And I'm just going to quickly bring those up, and I put my email on because I'd like to see if anybody else is interested in these things, if they're welcome to email me and chat further. But I'm really interested in, understanding historical impacts on adaptation pathways and sort of drawing on trait plasticity in the evolution space and seeing how that can apply into resilience theory, and thinking more about how we can try to adapt in this changing world and having more of the tools or the resources available to do that. And also on the health nature nexus of nature-based solutions. So how does this, how do nature-based solutions impact population health outcomes, and how can we more explicitly include health as a part of nature-based solution planning moving forward. And yeah, so I guess I'll just end there, sort of on the highlights and takeaways of my experience, which very broadly were experiencing a new place and gaining new perspectives. So like I said, it was just invaluable to be in a place that has so many unique climate related issues, nature related issues, political issues, and seeing how the country has really, it's such a resilient place. Like, they've done so much to try and change in the last 30 years since the end of apartheid. And so being able to talk with people about their experience in basically forming a new government and how that has worked over years and years has been such an eye-opening experience, and seeing where there are similarities and differences, and where I'm from in the United States, how our countries are similar and different, and how we tackle issues is really fascinating. Being in a biodiversity hotspot like that was really such a unique experience. and seeing a new perspective from like a global south perspective in particular, but just a different take on how to approach nature and how to manage it and how nature-based solutions can fit into that was a really important experience for me. And it allowed me to make new connections and have opportunities for collaboration. So these potential areas to potentially publish papers was great, but also just mainly having people to talk to about some of my ideas and about their research and their work. And yeah, it just was a really invaluable time for me to explore all of these different pathways and routes. And I just want to put some acknowledgements on here of my advisors who supported me in going there, the roadmap team who I worked with the entire time from abroad, and the Africa team who were invaluable people to talk to throughout my time there, and many, many others. But thanks to NATURA for the fellowship support and for sending me off on this journey, and for NSF for providing the funding as well, and to ASU for supporting me in doing that. I'll end with some questions and apologize for sort of speaking through some of those pieces, but yeah.
Thanks a lot. We have maybe some time for questions, maybe 5 minutes or so. Tessa, would that be fair?
I would say, yeah.
Okay. Does anybody have one? I mean, I can start off with a question. I'm just interested in this. You were talking about flooding and the impacts on of the lack of wastewater infrastructure, and I'm just wondering if you've seen any examples either in Cape Town or just in the Africa node that you're thinking about of combinations of very highly localized gray infrastructure and green infrastructure, which seems like it would be a better solution than massive wastewater treatment facilities in places that lack any at all.
Yeah, there are a couple of good examples of this. So there are a couple. One I'll highlight that is a research hub that they're trying to make sort of be that green-gray solution that you're talking about is the Water Hub, which is in Stellenbosch and tries to work so the Stellenbosch has partnerships with their other, like with the municipality and with other communities, particularly in informal settlements in Stellenbosch area, and they're trying to identify ways that the community can have that combined green-gray infrastructure using the Water Hub, which I think is a reclaimed water treatment facility that they're now using sort of as like a living lab space to workshop different ideas with the community to try and find ones that can fit this multi space. There's also a couple in the Cape Flats, so in that like sort of south of Cape Town main city, non-False Bay. There are a couple of water retention areas that were single use previously that I think now they're trying to build out into more of a multifunctional community space, and also building in green infrastructure for wastewater treatment. So there's a couple of different ways that they're trying to find these intermediate solutions that can fit for the community needs and preferences, as well as provide multiple functions to meet multiple needs. So I would highlight those as the main ones that come to mind.
Cool. That sounds great. Yeah. Also, I think there's a question in the chat about urban heat. Oh, it's so is in addition to flooding, were there any impacts of urban heat in that more dense area, particularly the informal settlements in the city?
Yeah, absolutely. So not while I was there in their winter to spring, so I did not personally experience this, but urban heat issues and urban heat island is a huge issue as well, and particularly going into these next few months will be a big concern particularly in informal settlements, both in Cape Town, but especially outside of Cape Town. Cape Town has a bit more of the wind factor and some of the more protection, not necessarily in the Cape Flats as well, but urban heat and the heat island effect is definitely a major concern. And in the informal settlements in particular, there isn't as much relief. There isn't really the type of structures that are available to protect, or nor is there the like air conditioning or air con. There isn't that kind of capacity. And that's another piece that was sort of interesting, is where the energy where the energy is lacking, and you can't have access to air conditioning, or in the winter into heat, that they had some of the coldest days as well that they've experienced in a long time. And now they also don't have heat because they don't have reliable power. So these are also driving some of these issues related to like weather health concerns. But yeah, heat is definitely an issue there as well.
Anyone else have a question for Becca? It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, for beautiful pictures too.
Yeah, mainly an excuse to share those.
Thanks so much. I do have a quick one, just sort of based on the urban heat question. I realize these are informal settlements, but are there ways that, there's attempts to prevent kind of more of a sprawl rather than consolidate the development in more denser cores? I ask only because I feel like, the landscape seems to be quite a resource to preserve. And I'm wondering if you're seeing rampant growth of these settlements in places that might be more ecologically sensitive than others.
Yeah. My understanding is that the informal settlements are, for the most part, all expanding, and that urban areas are expanding, and that there isn't a lot of, I think what was striking to me is that when I would talk to people about urbanization, there sort of was this notion that we knew that they're expanding, but that there isn't always tracking on it necessarily. So there's not always like an understanding of how fast it's happening, where it's like, sometimes I think in South Africa it's not necessarily the case, because a lot of the informal settlements are expanding in areas that were designated as places during apartheid. So a lot of those spaces are areas that were like historically people were moved to these places, and so that's where a lot of these places are now expanding. And I think that a lot of them are happening. What I'll say about where some of the informal settlements are in Cape Town in particular, the Cape Flats is one of the least vegetation, like there's almost no nutrients in the soil. So there's almost nothing that people can grow there. So that space, from like a plant perspective, is not very, I don't know, there's not a lot there, and there's nothing that will grow there again. But that, because of the expansion there's a lot of difficulty in restoring dunes and restoring some of the like sand dune spaces. So that's causing coastal erosion. So I think that the issues that are being faced at like where these places are, where these populations are growing, are really different and disparate. And it's really hard to like tackle exactly how to approach them, because they're expanding so quickly, and there isn't like the history of the land there is impacting the types of approaches that you can have and the type of development that you can do without causing other knock-on effects. So yeah, I know that's not really a good answer necessarily to your question, but I just wanted to try and, yeah.
No, it's helpful. It's definitely
Yeah.
helpful in understanding kind of the challenges. Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it also the case, Becca, it seems to me like, from at least what I observed there, is that many of these areas are already incredibly dense.
Yes.
They're just, houses piled on top of each other, and there's not much space to develop. In fact, that's one of the conflicts I think you identified earlier on in the presentation, right? Between the idea of having open space and the need to have land to actually live on.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there aren't really the multi-level types of housing in these places. So the density, it has to go out really when these are expanding. So unless if there are efforts to actively try and do that, or But then to do that, you basically, like, these aren't formal township, like they're not formal towns or cities, and so they don't have city support or infrastructure in the formal way that, you know, like the city of Cape Town has. And so I think that it's just a whole set of different issues that I'd never encountered before in the US, at the very least. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Kirsty. Those are good points.
All right, and any last final questions? No. All right, well, thank you so much, Becca. This was really a wonderful presentation, and I also enjoyed the pictures that you included. Super cool. So now we're going to move into our portion of the webinar where we basically just offer the stage to anyone who's on here who has any opportunities in their networks, or you know, that could be official or informal networks, any opportunities, any events, any research, quick pitches on research that they're doing. Please just raise your hand or take yourself off of mute if you have anything that you'd like to share. Yeah, Kirsty, you can go ahead. Or Kirsty.
There. Thank you. This was a really great presentation, and I'm pretty new to these webinars. I've been on the mailing list for a long time, but not really managed to attend anything. And I really enjoyed your work, Becca. So that's great. And I do work closely with Pippin. My affiliation is with the Future Water Institute at UCT, and I was really interested to hear you talking about the distributed green infrastructure across the city, because of course there is a very solid intention by the city to develop what they're calling, or they're referring to, a water sensitive city by 2040, and through the use of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure options throughout. So some research that we're doing that you might be interested in seeing, and maybe you did see it because you spoke about detention ponds and the use of existing stormwater infrastructure to create multifunctional urban areas that provide amenity, biodiversity, urban heat island reduction, plus water supply and flood alleviation. So these sort of multiple benefits. But what we're finding with our research is that whilst it does all that, there are real social issues around how we engage people, particularly in the lower income sort of Mitchell's Plain, Cape Flats area that you speak about, and how the different uses of those spaces are really dictated by each and every context. So it would be really interesting to talk to you a bit more about some of your cases and and how these things fit into different city contexts and how, you know, the different experiences play out. So thank you. I don't know if
That'd be
that's
great.
if I was supposed to do that now or earlier, but yeah.
I'd love to talk with you more. So yeah, it'd be great.
Any others? And if we don't, it's fine. We can also just end the webinar early, but just wanted to give everyone an opportunity for that.
Actually, if you don't mind, Tessa, I do have a question which made me think about it as the discussion before was going on. I was wondering, because this is something that I feel like we see a lot in informal settlements across the global South, is, you know, the tension between sort of the governance issues, if you will, for planning nature-based solutions. So either, you know, there are situations where, you know, the community itself is oriented more towards stewardship of natural resources and have that connection with, you know, the where they live. But in more urban areas, that kind of connection is somewhat lost. And, I was thinking, if you don't have a more formal way of controlling sprawl or understanding kind of how you could preserve these resources, or even for that matter, introduce new nature-based solutions in a planned and more formal setting, it's hard to kind of figure out, how the community voices can be heard and sort of help with designing those moving forward. And I'm wondering if anybody has some examples of where they've seen this kind of a community-based, nature-based solutions approach in informal settlements.
So if I can respond, there is a good example of that in Durban. I don't know if you are aware of the eThekwini, the Transformative Riverine project, the Sihlanzimvelo. That is quite a good one. And there are other examples in Cape Town too, where community-led initiatives linking low-income townships to green areas have been somewhat supported through either developers, housing developers, or through city processes themselves. So I could certainly share those on the group if you don't know of them already.
Yeah, I don't know of them. So thank you so much, Christy. That would be really helpful. And since you seem to have a lot more sort of knowledge and experience with these, do you mind sharing like how the actual approach of bringing the community into the planning around this happened? Was it just sort of a top down or a bottom up or somewhere in the middle intervention that got everybody to sort of collaborate on this?
So the one in Mosselbank, it's a Visante Kraal is the suburb in Cape Town. Becca's nodding, so maybe she knows about it. Is a low-income settlement that has an informal aspect to it as well. They're right on the Mosselbank River. And there was a housing development that was putting in sort of, again, social housing in this area. And as part of the environmental management plan, they had to do some rehabilitation along the river. But before then, there had been a community-driven cleanup sort of process that was happening with local members of the community. It happened to be a woman who was running a soup kitchen and a sort of safe house in this low-income settlement. And she is obviously a community-inspired person.
Yeah.
So she had already gathered some momentum with local people to develop a team of workers who have moved ahead with some not only river rehabilitation, but greening projects along the riverfront, in front of the settlement and within the settlement itself, and bringing people in different teams, upskilling them, making use of a champion in the housing development agency, and actually building it that way. I think the one in eThekwini was more top down. It was done as a C40 project, C40 project, a climate sort of adaptation project to see how they could involve. Although I say that already before then, there were community teams through their extended public works program who were involved in the river system. But what they have shown through the CFF project is the cost benefit. Which has been, I think, one of the first ones that have really come out of South Africa, is where they've clearly shown the positive impact of nature-based process along this river and involving people from the ground up.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. I I'm interested because I feel like there are some very similar cases in South India, or kind of, eastern part of India, where communities that have been living in certain geographies have always been sort of invested in preserving the natural resources, but then there's always a sort of tension when there are governance issues that come from top down, even if they are well intentioned, in terms of getting to a co-design or a collaborative sort of planning around these. So it's really great to hear that there are case studies that are supporting that kind of development paradigm. Thank you.
All right, last call. Any other comments or opportunities? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar. Thank you again, Becca, for the wonderful presentation. And you can find this webinar recording on our website. You will find it soon. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day or night. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's
everyone.
great. Thanks,
Thanks,
Becca.
everyone.